Welcome back to the channel. So today's a little different because we're in an echoey room and I forgot my power cord to my microphone. So you're just gonna have to deal with this echoey laptop microphone for a little bit. But we're gonna talk about JavaScript if-else statements today. And so what that is an if-else statement is basically saying, well, if there's a condition that the computer or program comes across, then we're gonna make a decision based on that condition. So for example, if you're playing a game where you're flipping a coin, right? So we can say heads do something and tails do something. That's the most rudimentary way. Or, you reach a fork in the road where you need to decide, do I go left or do I go right? Do I turn around? JavaScript is the same way. In fact, all code is the same way. We evaluate everything that we take in, then we decide what to do, and then we need to run a loop if possible, right? If the condition's not met. It's a little confusing right now to kind of think about that, but what I'll do is, why don't we go over some slides and then we'll talk about it together, okay? So when we first run our code, the first thing we need to do is we need to evaluate. We need to figure out what is being asked, which values am I comparing, and what will be affecting my decision-making process. The second thing we need to do is to say, we need to decide. Well, after we evaluate, then how do we decide what to do, right? So the script needs to decide what to do next. And then finally, do I need to run a loop? So when should I stop making my decision, and how long should I keep searching for a value? So why don't we take a look at some next slides, and in this case, we're gonna use a silly analogy to understand how if-else conditions work. So let's pretend that there's a large tiger between you and the door. And if there's a large tiger between you and the door, the first thing you need to do is to evaluate. Well, we say, what is the total distance between this tiger and the door? Is there another door? What does an angry tiger look like? Is the tiger facing you? So all of these are conditions that you must first evaluate. Then we need to decide. We need to decide, well, if the tiger is aggressive, now if is the main keyword, then you run like hell. But if not, then you can just walk past the tiger. And then finally, we think about a loop. If you're being chased by a tiger, then you keep running. And you just keep running if you're being chased. That's this endless loop, right? But the loop will break as soon as the tiger stops chasing you. Okay? So let's think about comparison operators. So there's two components of a decision. We need to have an expression that is evaluated, which returns a value, and this expression is usually true or false, but not always. And a conditional statement that says what to do in a given situation. So when we evaluate this condition, we need to compare, and this comparison returns a value of true and false. So we compare two things, right? We compare values. So for example, let's pretend we're arguing, and if we flip a coin, if heads is true, then do this, right? If tails is true, then do this. And so code would normally skip something if it's not true. And this is based on the concept of if, then, and else. But in JavaScript, we can just say if, and then else. So if the condition is met, we execute the code, one or more statements. Or else, your code just does something different or skips into the next step. And it'll keep skipping steps until we find out what's true. So let's take a look at this example. The condition is highlighted. So we say food price is greater than 50. If the food price is greater than 50, we say it's too expensive. Or else we say it sounds reasonable. Now look at the syntax. Look at where the mustache braces are, and look at those keywords of if and else. So we say, let's pretend that food price we set to be $40. Well, what's gonna happen if it's $40? Well, if food price is 40, it's not greater than 50, so then we would say, sounds reasonable, right? Because this first condition is not true. But what if the food price was 50? What would happen? Well, if you said sounds reasonable, then you're correct, because it's not greater than 50. But the very second it becomes greater than 50, like 50.00001, then we say it's too expensive. So let's take a look at an else-if statement. An else-if statement basically says, if we fall within these ranges. And don't mind those ampersands in the second condition. Ampersand, or the and symbol, I'm going to teach you that logic later. But and basically says both things must be true. Okay? So if the food price is greater than 50, but less than 40, then you might buy it. And some of you kind of might see this logical error that's happening there, but it's okay. We're going to work on it later. All right? But look at the last condition of the else. If it's not caught anywhere, then the else is the last thing to run. So the first one is the if. Is that true? No. Go to the else if. Is that true? Yes or no? And finally, the else, if nothing else is true. Now, let's take a look at these evaluating conditions. So we have double equals, triple equals, an exclamation point equals, and an exclamation point double equals. If you want, why don't you pause the video, write these down, and kind of understand where these are, okay? So what you want to pay attention to is the double and the triple equals. The double equals basically just compares two values to see if they're the same. The triple equals basically says, look, I'm very strict about it. Not only must these two values be correct, but the data types also must be correct. And if you remember learning previously, data types are like string and integers and whatnot, okay? So we have a double equals and a triple equals. So pause the video, write them down, and then come back when you're ready. We have more evaluating conditions: greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, and less than or equal to. And I might kind of just jam through these, but like I said, if you want, just pause the video and then come back to them when you're ready. We're going to open another program, and when you come back, we're going to build something together. All right, so open Replit or VS Code if you want, but I'm going to be using Replit for our example. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to build the following. We're going to build a two-player game, which basically says we're going to ask the player for a number, we're going to ask the second player for a number, and we're going to output to the second player if they are correct. If they're wrong, we'll tell them they're wrong. If they're correct, we'll tell them, hey, you won. All right, welcome back to our coding. So we're going to build this two-player game. So the first thing, let's make it as simple as possible, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to say we need to ask the user or the first player for a number, right? And this is assuming that the first player chooses. So we're going to say var player1 equals, and why don't we just make it a simple prompt, and then we'll say enter a number between 1 and 5. All right? That's the first one. Let me kind of move all this over so you can see. All right. And then what we'll do now, make the screen a little bigger so you can see. There you go. And then once the player enters, we're going to say var player2. And then this is where the second player is going to enter his or her number. So we say player2, guess a number between 1 and 5. So if we've done this correctly, the first player is going to enter a number between 1 and 5, and the second player is going to guess a number between 1 and 5. So now we need to run these statements. We say, well, there's 3 possible conditions, right? That are pretty simple. There's actually more. Like for example, what if the person doesn't enter a number? But we'll deal with that later. So we'll say if, and then we have our conditions. So we wrap the conditions in parentheses. If player 1 is equal to player 2, and then we put these mustache braces. Now this is where these statements get written. If you look at it, it's tabbed in, right? So this is your nested coding block. We're going to write our code in here. We're going to say, well, if player 1 equals to player 2, then we'll say window.alert, and then we'll say you win. Okay? Well, what happens if they don't win? Well, else. Now remember, in an else condition, you don't need the parentheses. You don't need it because there's no conditions to check. You're only going to check conditions if it's an if or an else if case. So else, we say window.alert, you lose, right? And then to prove to the player how they lost, we could say you lose, player one chose, and then plus player 1. So we're gonna show them the number that was chosen, okay? All right, so let's run this. So I'm player 1, I enter a number between 1 and 5. I'm gonna say 2, I'm gonna hit enter. Then player 2, I'm gonna guess a number and I'm gonna say 4. I lost, player 1 selected 2. Well, there you go, right? So there's a really simple game. Why don't we modify this now with some light conditional statements, all right? So we have else if, and what we're gonna do now is we're gonna say, well, if player 2, if you guessed too high, we're gonna tell you that you're too high, all right? So we say else if player 2, if the number is greater than player 1, we say window.alert, you guessed too high. Inversely, we say else if, we can do more else if statements. We say player 2 is less than player 1, and we say window.alert, you guessed too low. So we're telling the user, by making this a little more dynamic, by saying either 1, you're too high, or you're too low, right? And later on, we'll run this in a loop. That means we'll give them like 3 chances, but for now, they lost. They guessed too high, and then we just say, guess too high. Player 1 selected plus player 1, which means we're gonna tell the tell player 2 that, hey, you lost, but this is the actual number that was selected, so they don't feel like they got cheated. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and run this. Let's try it. So if I say 2 and I guess 1, I guess too low. All right, let's try again. Let's run it. I say 3, I say 3. Hey, I win. And finally, well, let's run it again. Right, I guess 3. Player 2 guesses 4. I guess too high. Okay? Good. All right, so this kind of covers the part 1 of this if-else-if decision-making process. There's going to be more, so for now, just kind of deal with this, and then modify it. Try to build on it if you can, right? Build guessing games. Use that math random function. How about that? Why don't you try this? Use that math random function that you learned earlier and have the computer automatically guess a number, then have the player try to guess the number, and then compare using an if-else statement to see if you guessed the number correctly, or you guessed too high, or you guessed too low. Okay? All right. If anything else, leave comments below, and then I'll see you in the next lesson where we go over more conditional operators and logical rules. Bye.